Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm Peter Curtie, a research fellow in the Religion and the Free Society programme at the Centre for Independent Studies, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to Macquarie Bank for this evening's event, Fractured Families, the Cost of Not Talking About Children and Marriage. Writing in The Spectator a few weeks ago, journalist Ian Moore was reflecting on the violence and bloodshed that had erupted on Sydney's streets over the New Year period. Blaming booze was not the answer, Moore argued. Rather, society as a whole has taken a wrong turn, with the erosion of respect for people and property and the acceptance of dysfunctionality as the new norm. Far from being the cause of dysfunction, alcohol, drugs, and the normalisation of violence are symptoms of that dysfunction. The emergence of a new breed of what psychologist Michael Carr-Gregg describes as extremely narcissistic, underfathered adolescent males is indicative of the more serious problem created by failed marriages and broken families. Our three speakers this evening will propose that the biggest risk to social, educational, and developmental outcomes for children comes from the broken home. It's time to set aside political correctness and encourage them to make responsible decisions that put children first. Our first speaker is Patrick Parkinson, who is Professor of Law at the University of Sydney and a specialist in family law, child protection, and the law of equity and trusts. He's currently President of the International Society of Family Law. Will you please welcome Professor Patrick Parkinson?
Well, it's a great pleasure to join you here tonight, but a very difficult topic to talk about. Whenever you talk about this issue, people think of you as an old fogey. Well, I think of myself as a young fogey, but I'm the wrong side of 50 now, so maybe I'm not able to use that line anymore. But what we're seeing is a certain group in society who are harking back to the old days, to the days when most people married and everything was much more stable, and a resistance to that coming very strongly from what these days we call the elites, and it's particularly the professional elites in journalism, law, the universities and so on. And what makes the sort of 50s retro so difficult for us to argue is that since then we've seen the sexual revolution, the growth of a secular society, the vehement rejection of traditional Christian morality on sex and family life. And there are two sacred cows, as it were, two beliefs which are held to as articles of faith in all of this. The first one, that family structure simply doesn't matter, whether it's a married family, a de facto cohabiting family, a single-parent family, same-sex family, it doesn't matter. Kids do fine, and everybody should let others live as they choose. The second sort of belief is that private sexual behaviour is never a matter for censure. Well, unless you're the president of France and you're driving through Paris on a motorbike with your security guard behind you holding the croissants and the prophylactics, even then the French had trouble knowing quite what they thought about this. After all, he wasn't married, so he wasn't committing adultery, was he? But you see in that whole thing the difficulty of talking about marriage and sex as if it were a public issue and not merely a matter for private concerns. What I'm seeing is some alarming trends in what's happening with children and young people and what's happening in families. This is just some figures which will give you an idea. For kids born just after World War II, 1946 to 1955, about 9% experienced their parents living apart by the age of 15. 2.6% at birth. Some of those, of course, would have been widowed, others born into different situations. 6.3% due to parental separation. Now, by 1981 to 1985, the cohort of kids born in that year, in those years, 25%, 1/4, have experienced their parents separating by the age of 15, 6.5% born into single mother families. And those are figures, of course, from up to 30 years ago, or more than 30 years ago, of kids who were born at that time. The numbers of kids born to single mums at that time has more than doubled. So you can see that the trends are of rapid change. Now, people talk about the divorce rate. The divorce rate is very little a part of this problem. Divorce rates have gone up a little bit over the last 30 years and then down a bit, but they've been relatively stable, all things being considered. What has really made a difference is the growth of cohabitation and the instability of de facto relationships, even when there are children. This is some statistics from a recent study at the ANU. The odds of a cohabiting couple with children breaking up were more than 7 times as high as a married couple who had not lived together before marriage. Now you may say, but who doesn't live together before marriage these days? Well, some of us, but nearly 80% of people do. So we are the odd lot, the religious, the traditional. But even those who have lived together for a period and gone on to marry, their relationships are very much more stable, more than 4 times the rate of breakup for those who lived together without marrying as those who went on to marry. And these are statistics which are mirrored all over the Western world. Wherever you look, once you control for education, socioeconomic status, all different factors, you find that it's at least 2.5 to 3 times as high a rate of breakdowns in cohabiting couples as in married couples. Marriage involves resilience, which it seems that cohabiting couples simply do not have to the same extent. In terms of kids being born outside of marriage, the rate in Australia is now around 35%, and you'll see the very rapid escalation from the late 1960s through to the present time. Now, 2/3 of those are born to couples who are living together, they are cohabiting. 1/3 probably are born to single mums. About 12% of all births now are to single mums. And that is a massive increase in 25 years. This is what is driving the numbers of kids who are experiencing their parents separating before the age of 15. Some of them have never had a father at least, in the home. They've had males in the home and not fathers. Others have experienced their parents separating, usually at a very young age. Cohabiting couples tend to break up quite early compared to married couples with kids 3, 4, 5 years old, that sort of age. These are international trends. The ex-nuptial birth rate in Britain is now over 45%, in the USA 41%. In several Scandinavian countries and in Estonia, it's more than half of all births. Estonia, I think, takes the record with about 60% of all births being ex-nuptial. And that's for all children. If you look at the firstborn children who are ex-nuptial, the rate is very much higher because people then go on to marry a little bit later in their lives. So these are really rapid changes in our society. And together with that, and I'm suggesting there may be a causal connection, although I say that with some diffidence, we're seeing a growing crisis in child protection and adolescent mental health. This is the figures from all over Australia of the number of substantiated child abuse cases in Australia. You'll see in 1999 at 107,000 notifications, rising to 2008 to 2009 to 340,000. A little bit of a drop-off after that, but that's because New South Wales changed its criteria in a very significant way. Look at the number of kids in out-of-home care, which is the last column. You'll see it's more than doubled in 10 years, from 16,000 to 35,000. And these are not primarily more kids coming into care, but fewer kids going out of care. These kids are from homes with such deeply rooted problems, they simply cannot be returned home. And there's a real crisis of finding enough places in foster care homes in particular for these children. Together with that, we're seeing really quite an alarming increase in mental disorders amongst young people. 14% of children and young people between the ages of 4 and 17 had a mental disorder in 1997. 26% of those aged 16 to 24 have a mental disorder now, compared to 1 in 5 in the general population. That includes substance disorders, but you can see the figures. And all over the Western world, we're seeing a significant increase in mental health problems amongst young people. In some countries, some studies showing a doubling of those problems in a generation, in 20 or 25 years. These are figures which I published in a report called For Kids' Sake. They're derived from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data. And you'll see that these are kids who were hospitalised for intentional self-harm, hospitalised. So they were not just going to the emergency ward, they were admitted to hospital. And you'll see there was a 66% increase in 10 years, with girls self-harming at 6 times the rate of the boys. If you look at the figures for 15 to 17-year-olds, then you're looking at a 90% increase in self-harm by older adolescent girls in a 10-year period. Now, if the figures had gone up 5%, 10%, we would say that was a very adverse trend. But we are seeing the figures doubling virtually in a 10-year period. And while 2005, 2006 may have been a recent high point in the data, these are figures from New South Wales from 1992 through to 2012, and you'll see the broad trend. Females aged 15 to 24 is the top line there in the maroon, and you can see the shape of the graph. For boys, a less dramatic increase, but still some. A lot of the most disturbing statistics are around adolescent girls. Now, I know Peter in his introduction focused on boys, and there are real issues with that too, but the really worrying trends, the most worrying trends, are with adolescent girls. To give you some idea, teenagers are now engaging in sexual acts at a younger age and with more people than in previous generations. A study done by La Trobe University found with year 12 females having 5 or 6 drinks in a day, it had gone up from 17% to 32% in 6 years in terms of very heavy binge drinking. Binge drinking can lead to unwanted sex. The same girls, including now year 10 and year 12 girls, an increase in unwanted sex from 28% to 38% of all girls in that study reporting unwanted sex. And the main reasons, alcohol or pressure from a partner. In terms of STDs, there was a 4-fold increase in rates of chlamydia infection amongst children, young people aged 10 to 14 over a 10-year period. If you look at the rates of increase in gonorrhea in particular, in 4 years across the country, there was a 67% increase recently between 2008 and 2012 in rates of gonorrhea, and that's mostly in the 15 to 19 and 20 to 40-ish population. These are very alarming trends. Now, is this related to family structure? Well, of course, all these social trends are have multiple causes, and it's like peeling the layers of an onion to see the different interactions. But what we're seeing is these alarming trends, which are very much in parallel with the increase in family breakdown and the numbers of kids born to single mums. And what are the reasons? There's a huge body of research on all of this. And the thing that we know probably better than almost anything else in this area of social science is that kids are badly affected by conflict. Not controlled conflict, not conflict which is managed within a relationship. That can be very educational for kids to see parents working it out, very angry with each other, but working it out and coming to a resolution. But so many kids are exposed to destructive conflict and violence in the family. Now, that can be so in married couples too, of course. The old wisdom was, well, it's better to leave an unhappy relationship than to expose kids to that conflict. But what we've learned over the last 40 years is that conflict does not end on separation. Often it increases on separation. There's arguments about the property, there's arguments about child support, often endless arguments about child support. There's arguments about parenting styles. When you're in an intact relationship, you've got to negotiate with each other around bedtimes and food and parties and all the other things that kids need guidance about and boundaries on. But when you're in 2 separate households, you've got nobody who's the referee of those disputes. Very often in marriages, how it works out is that mum and dad talk about it and whatever mum says goes, right? But when the couple have split up, if they're split up, then dad has his own power center, his own responsibility for making these decisions, and around food, around bedtimes, around homework, all these sorts of issues. Mum and dad may clash over different values and rules. And there's the impact that new partners have, or extraordinary impacts sometimes, in terms of increasing hostility between mum and dad when dad has a new partner or mum has a new partner. And there's lots of dynamics around that. And what we find from research is that there are significantly higher levels of conflict in step families, and even low in parent families, that's between parents and children, than in intact families. So that's the first reason. The second one is socioeconomic pressures. It's very difficult to go from one household to two. It's very difficult. Financially, you've got 2 lots of rent, 2 mortgages, whatever it may be, but also the little things, 2 Xboxes, 2 bikes, 2 lots of Christmas presents which need to be generous, and so on and so forth. And for many parents going through separation, probably most, the financial struggles can be enormous. But together with that, women in particular are juggling work and family, maybe moving from part-time work back into the full-time workforce and having to deal with children who are often distressed or acting out or depressed and keeping things within. It can be a terrible struggle. As I myself have known over my history in the last few years, the struggles are both social and financial. That leads to people to be depressed, to not have energy and time for their kids, not have emotional strength to reach out and meet the children's needs because they're too busy meeting their own needs. And then finally, the risks of abuse, which I know Jeremy will be referring to. The reality is that the risk of all forms of child abuse, but particularly child sexual abuse, are very much higher from unrelated males. There's something about being a father which is actually very protective of your child, very protective. There's a deeply ingrained instinct to protect, and actually very few biological fathers abuse their children compared to the levels of abuse in the general community towards unrelated children. So let me conclude by saying this, that marriage is a really important issue for the economy, for the society. There is no need for a left-right divide. There's no need to divide into 50s idolizing retros and progressives, because actually, if we're concerned about the future of our younger generation, we're concerned about social inclusion, then we need to be concerned about promoting marriage. And that's an issue which is very hard to talk about, because on the progressive side of politics, there's such a deeply ingrained belief that family structure doesn't matter and that these issues are purely private. But the future of our economy depends on it, the future of our health system. We have an alarming problem of mental health, and it will only get worse unless we can support families better. All families, whatever their constellation. I've made proposals for how we can better support single-parent families. I've made proposals for how we can support the most vulnerable. It doesn't need much government money, but it does need a will, and it's time to break the silence. Thank you.